All right. Hello, everyone. So this is part one of the lecture that will focus on the late 19th century and the opening of Korea up to the Protectorate Treaty. So we are basically going to look at a very short time period. So in terms of years, it will not be long. We're looking at 1876 to 1910. But this is a period that is very chaotic and very turbulent in Korea. And so things are changing very rapidly, and decade by decade, sometimes year to year, things change very drastically. So we're going to look at this particular period. Now, there's one thing that I would like to make clear as we go into this lecture, because as we discussed in the last week, we looked at the system of foreign relations for the Joseon Dynasty, and that the system, the tributary system, had been in place for hundreds of years, but this was a system that was regulated and that was set up in such a way that it was exclusionary. So the Joseon Dynasty really didn't interact with many other countries. They mainly interacted with the Ming and the Qing dynasties, so whatever was in the Chinese mainland. And they interacted to a lesser extent with Japan and the Jurchens. But for the most part, that was about it. And if you'll recall, the reasons for this was because it was a rather dangerous time, and so it was necessary to secure the borders. So for Korea to secure the coastline and then to secure the northernmost border, this was the policy that the Joseon Dynasty implemented. It was also the policy of the Ming Dynasty. They were very isolationist, and so was Tokugawa Japan. So even though at the beginning of Tokugawa they had frequent trade with other countries, this stopped. So in general, this was how countries behaved, and interaction was limited with each other. And I don't want you to confuse this with xenophobia, because this is in fact not xenophobia. Xenophobia, if we look at the dictionary definition, the definition is an irrational fear or hatred of foreigners. And so if we go by this definition, the Joseon Dynasty they made its decisions to limit interaction with other countries not based on an irrational fear, but actually based on something that was very logical and very rational. And so this is something that we will discuss in this lecture. And as you know, that we can see in today's society that xenophobia, this irrational fear of or hatred of foreigners, is something that is recurring in today's society now. And we see this in the form of anti-immigration laws and countries closing down their borders and being very insular. And so I think that this particular lecture has very important lessons for us to learn, and it has a lot of relevance for the times that we're living in today. So let's keep this in mind. Let's keep in mind that when we think of xenophobia, when we think of these things such as wanting to keep out foreigners and those who are different from us, what does this engender, and what kind of consequences are there from this? And if we look at the past and we look at history, we can glean many lessons from this. So Again, I don't want you to think of this as xenophobia, which is something that we are seeing these days, because during the late 19th century, this was actually not irrational, but was really quite rational for the Joseon dynasty. All right, so to start off, we need to look at Western imperialism and the expansion of European empires. So because these European empires had begun to expand and to colonize various parts of the world, and then eventually expanded into areas of Asia, this had a profound influence and disrupted the very established system of interstate relations in the East Asian region. So let's take a little bit of a look at these European empires. This began with Spain and Portugal and the age of exploration. These two empires had expanded into the Americas and parts of Africa, the Middle East, India, and East Asia. Now, after their rise and eventual decline, they were overtaken by Holland, Britain, and France in the 17th and 18th century. If you look at this map here, this is a map of a portion of the British Empire in the 18th century. For those of you who are from the United States may recall that we were, in fact, a British colony originally. So these are the original colonies in America. And at some point, because of the American Revolution, this was about 1765 to 1783, there was an uprising, and America then declared its independence from the British Empire. And the loss of these 13 colonies in North America, this was a big blow to Britain, because it was the most populous of all its colonies. But after they lost the America, they then turned their attention to other parts of the world, and they started turning their attention to Africa and India and parts of Asia. Now, this also coincided with the rise of the Dutch Empire. So the Dutch also, they started focusing on different areas in the similar part of the world. And so we have this rivalry between the British and the Dutch. And so with this, we have the establishment of the British East India Company, and they begin to dominate in this area. And there's also the establishment of the Dutch East India Company. And so they are vying for power. And at some point, this rivalry is resolved, because there's a series of Anglo-Dutch wars between the two countries in the 17th century. But it was ended when the Dutch William of Orange then ascended the English throne. So a peace was brought between the Netherlands and England, and the deal was made that the spice trade of the East Indies, in this area right here, would go to the Netherlands, and then the textiles industry of India here would then go to England. But the textile industry soon overtook the spice industry of the East Indies here in terms of profitability. And so by the 18th century, the British were able to overtake the Dutch. And so we see the continued expansion and growth of the British Empire. So here we see the British Empire as it existed in the 1920s. And if you've ever heard the expression, the sun never sets on the British Empire, well, this is why. Because the British Empire was so expansive that at its height, at any time of the day, there was the British held sway or jurisdiction over parts of the world throughout the globe and at any part of the day that the sun was shining. So that's where this expression comes from. By 1922, the British controlled, they held jurisdiction over about 458 million people. This was about 1/4 of the world's population at the time. And then they also controlled about 1/4 of the Earth's total land area. So it was the largest empire that existed at this time. The second largest empire was the French Empire. Now, the French had begun to establish colonies in North America, the Caribbean, and in India, following the Spanish and Portuguese successes. But then they lost out to the British. And so in the 19th century, the French started to focus on Africa and Southeast Asia. So we see that we have the expansion of the French Empire in the 19th to the 20th century. They grow into the second largest empire in the world. And after, when we get to the late 19th century, they start to express much more interest in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. And so they, at their peak, they controlled about 9% of the Earth's total area. And here we see some pictures from French Indochina. This first one is from a French outpost in China. This second one here is from Hanoi. And these two are also from Hanoi in Vietnam. All right, so why are these empires expanding and going around colonizing different parts of the world? What is the reason for establishing these colonies? Well, as these two empires are industrializing, as they are producing more and more products, and as their population grows, they need markets. So they need markets for surplus production, they need outlets for surplus capital, they need to secure sources for raw materials, and they need more living space for their growing population. Europe is a very rather small area, and it's very difficult to expand your territory there, and so it's easier to go out and populate other areas. There's also this idea of the spread of civilization. The British and the French believe that because they came from a Christian-based civilization and culture, that it was part of their white man's burden to go out to uncivilized countries and to help them improve and to become civilized. This was part of their justification for going out to colonize these different areas. And then by the 19th century, we begin to see a focus on Asia. So as you can see here, the French had taken over Indochina, the Netherlands are down here, the Spanish were in the Philippines. So they're really encroaching upon this area of East Asia by the time we get to the 19th century. Now, when the European powers arrived in Asia, or East Asia, they started to establish different types of control. So you can go in and colonize. You go in, you take over a territory, and you establish a colonial administration. But this requires a lot of resources and a lot of investment. So they started to develop different types of control that were more that were less costly and that were more efficient. So, for example, they would establish a protectorate, and a protectorate is when a certain territory or state acknowledges that another state, the imperial state, is going to act as their protector and guarantee their security. So this is just short of colonial control, but it's not official colonization. There is something called a concession or a leasehold, and this is kind of like a temporary or unequal contract where the imperial power goes into a territory and they are allowed to occupy and to administer it. So the most typical example of this is Hong Kong. And this is a picture that we see here is when Hong Kong was occupied by the British, and we have the British flag being raised. A third type is a sphere of influence. And the sphere of influence is determined by several imperialist states. And they agree that there's a territory and they all want a portion of it or some kind of influence over a portion of it. And so to avoid going into all-out war against and fighting over this territory, they agreed to divide it up and say, okay, you can exercise your influence over this area, and you can exercise influence over this area. So these are called spheres of influence. So there's a shift from direct colonization to the establishment of informal empires, which is less direct, requires limited force, much less resources, and oftentimes these are enacted or implemented through trade agreements and unequal treaties. This political cartoon that we see here, this represents the carving up of China. So here we have represented here England, Russia, Germany, France, and Japan, and they are all carving up portions of China into their spheres of influence. So then what happens when these European empires then enter into the area? They are operating under a very different system of foreign relations. In East Asia, we have a very established form of foreign relations in the form of the tributary system, but the European countries are operating under a system of relations that is based on international law. And this is based on the idea that all members of, or all nations, they interact with each other on the basis of equality and reciprocity. So the idea, and international law is based on this, the idea is that regardless of your size and your population, a nation state, every nation state has sovereignty. And every nation state must recognize the sovereignty of the other nations. So it's reciprocal and it is equal because all nations have this sovereignty. So you recognize this, you respect this. This was based on what they believe to be a system of civilized nations, but really what we see is a new hierarchy of power that emerges from this, and the European powers, when they arrive in East Asia, they see the tributary system and they do not recognize it as valid. So they do not recognize the tributary system, and they have that it's completely foreign to them. They don't understand how the tributary system works. You know, it sounds like these vassal states are colonies of China because of, you know, their inferior position. So it's confusing for the Europeans. And then they also begin to force countries in the area to sign unequal treaties. And these unequal treaties are forced signings. So basically, Britain would come in, let's say they go into China, and they say, we want to open up trade with you. If you don't sign this trade treaty, then we're going to blow you up. And so it's under the threat of military aggression that this occurs. And once the treaty is signed, the terms of the treaty are often unequal. So there's an imbalance in benefits and rights that favor Britain and become a disadvantage for the other country, such as China. Okay, so we see that the British begin to enter into China. They had been trading with the Chinese for a very long time, but initially, what is it that the British wanted from the Chinese? What were they importing from the Chinese? What they really wanted was tea, porcelain, and silk. These were the main things that they wanted. But you have to trade with something, right? The British have to give something in return to the Chinese. What do the Chinese want from the British? Well, if we look at the 17th century, the 18th century, when they first starting to trade with the British, the Qing Empire, they consider themselves to be the strongest entity in the region, the most powerful entity in the region. And the British bring with them some interesting trinkets like mechanical clocks or musical instruments. These are not impressive to the Chinese, and they are certainly not necessary to the Chinese economy, and they don't have mass appeal. So as far as the Chinese are concerned, there isn't much that the Europeans have to offer that they want. So they ask for silver. So in exchange for tea, porcelain, and silk, the British are giving China silver. What do you think is more valuable, especially over time, and especially given that the British are importing massive amounts of tea, porcelain, and silk into Europe? Well, over time, the trade balance becomes uneven in China's favor because they're getting all the silver. And so to resolve this and to reverse the imbalance of trade, the British start illegally importing opium into China. And this becomes a huge problem because there are thousands of Chinese that become addicted to opium. And so just by importing this opium, the British are able to reverse the trade imbalance. And so now you have the Chinese that are running a trade deficit to the British. And so this comes to a head in the 19th century. And the Qing dynasty says, okay, we need to put a stop to this. And so it tells its authorities down in Canton, which is the trading port that the British were allowed to come in and trade with China. They tell the Canton authorities, Okay, you need to clamp down on this illegal opium. So in 1839, the Chinese confiscate at Canton 20,000 chests of opium. And this roughly translates into today's terms 1,200 tons or 2.6 million pounds of opium. So this is a massive amount of opium and a huge amount of wealth. So they seize this, they confiscate it. This angers the British, as you can imagine. So the British attack the Chinese, and this leads to the First Opium War. So this occurs in 1839 to 1842. The Chinese were defeated by the British. The British had just superior firepower. And so an unequal treaty is signed between the Qing dynasty and Britain. And as a result of this unequal treaty, the British are able to open up additional ports to trade. So they had originally been confined to one port of trade at Canton. And so now additional ports are opened up to trade to the British. And the British are also able to seize Hong Kong. So this is when Hong Kong becomes British territory. And then we have the Second Opium War. So again, the British were not really fully satisfied with the terms of the unequal treaty. They wanted even more access to China to be able to trade. And so the British and the French, they kind of pick on the Qing dynasty, and they instigate a second Opium War. And the Qing dynasty lose this war as well. So as a result of their loss, another unequal treaty is signed. And in this treaty, we have additional ports that are opened up to trade to China, or to the British and the French. And also now this means that foreigners can travel into the interior of the country. So whereas before, foreigners were confined to only staying within the port city like Shanghai, but now they can travel into China and they can go wherever they want. And this also means that we have more unequal treaties. So this is a huge disruption for the Chinese economy, more foreigners, and more trade. I should also mention that at the end of the First Opium War, one of the treaty stipulations was that European Christians could now evangelize within China. Okay, so the British, when it came to Korea, they were aware that Korea had a special relationship with China. They were aware that Korea had an isolationist policy. And so because they were more interested in China and less interested in Korea, which is a very, very small country, they sort of approached Korea, but then since they were rebuffed, they pretty much left Korea alone, and then were very cautious when it came to approaching Korea. Because if we look at this map, obviously this is the biggest market that you want to aim for rather than Korea. Okay, now let's look at what happened with Japan. Yeah, the Americans were also starting to establish a presence in Asia. They had come off the Civil War. They were starting to rebuild, and they were moving into Reconstruction, and were at the beginning stages of emerging as a new superpower. but they enter into the region of Asia, and they are kind of based out of China, and started trading there. But this individual, Commodore Perry, decides, let's try to open up Japan for trade. So Commodore Perry, he is sent to Japan. He arrives with these black ships. And these are armed merchant ships. And you can imagine that as they are sailing up the river, their way to Tokyo, the Japanese see these huge black ships and they're like freaking out. So he arrives in Tokyo and he tells the authorities there, I'm going to come back in a year. We want to sign a trade treaty with you. You must sign it, or else if you don't sign it, we're going to start blowing you up. So the following year, this occurred in 1853 to 1854. He arrives, comes back in 1854. The Japanese are forced to sign this unequal treaty, and this opens up Japan to trade with the West. Now, the Japanese, what they saw and what they felt was that, all right, this is the current context that we are living in. We have these Western imperialist powers that are coming into the area, and they're trying to take over certain places. Even though we have a military government, we are unable to defend ourselves. And so their vulnerability was exposed through this. And they felt that they were lucky that the Americans didn't want to just come in and take over. So they started to look to these Western imperialist powers as a model. And they figured, okay, if we want to preserve ourselves and survive, we also need to accumulate power and we need to expand. So this is what precipitates the Meiji Restoration. And you have these slogans such as wealthy country, strong army. And the Japanese, they went through this reform, which was all-encompassing. They reformed the government, the economy, the social system, the educational system. They sent sightseeing visits to America and the United States, and to Europe, and they looked at the postal system, the schools, the parliament, the railroad system. They looked at everything, and then they brought back with them and picked and chose what aspects of it they wanted to implement to Japan in order to create a wealthy country and a strong army. So this meant building up the economy and modernizing the military. All right. Now, at the same time, we have the rule of the Daewongun. So as you remember, Gojong took the throne at age 12, and his father was the one who was really ruling and making the political decisions. And his idea was to strengthen the kingship and finances, to continue with the isolationist policy, and he was also anti-Catholic. We will talk about the anti-Catholic policies in more detail later on when we look at Christianity. But his isolation policies, he implemented them across the board to repel the British and the French and the Russians and the Germans and the Americans. And this was all based on the fact that he was aware of the geopolitical context. He's looking over at Qing China and he's saying that they're being subjected to the First Opium War, the Second Opium War, signing unequal treaties, the loss of Hong Kong, more ports open to trade, more foreigners living in in China, and he's saying to himself, this is really bad. And then he looks over at Japan, sees that Japan is also forced open, even though they had a strong military. They were defenseless against the Americans, and they are also forced to sign an unequal treaty. And this is extremely disturbing for the Joseon Dynasty and for the Daewongun. So this is the context in which Korea is looking at the world and looking at its neighbors and what's going on. And its isolationist policy is only further cemented by a series of incidents that occur. So we'll begin with the General Sherman incident, which occurred in the summer of 1866. This was an American merchant ship, but it was a heavily armed merchant ship. And so the General Sherman, a different ship before them, a U.S. ship, had been shipwrecked on the coast of Korea. And those that had been shipwrecked, they were treated very kindly. The Koreans fed them and took care of them, and then repatriated them back through China. So they sent them up through China and said, okay, go along your merry way now. So the Americans hear about this and they think, oh, maybe the Koreans will be interested in signing a trade treaty with us. So they send the General Sherman. And there was a crew of Americans, English, Chinese, and Malays, but the interpreter was an Anglican missionary. He was English. They arrive and they start sailing up the Taedong River. Let me move this. They start sailing up the Taedong River up towards Pyongyang. Okay, and as they enter into these waters here and start sailing up, the local officials are coming out with the guards, and they're telling them, you have to go back, turn around, you do not have authorization to come here. But they just ignore all of this. They flagrantly ignore this, and they just keep on sailing up the river to Pyongyang. And so once they arrive in Pyongyang, the interpreter says to the local officials there, we demand entrance into the city. And if you don't give us entrance, then we're going to fire upon you. So, of course, the Koreans said no. And then the waters receded. And when the waters receded, the boat was stuck. So the crew of the General Sherman, they had disembarked and they had stolen food and they had stolen water, and they had kidnapped Korean women and take them back to the ship. So when the water level dropped, you have these Korean soldiers that start to approach the ship. And so the crew fired upon the Koreans, killing 7 and wounding 5. So now the governor, he comes, he's the governor of Pyongyang. You know, he's responsible for these people and what is happening here. And as far as the governor is concerned, the Americans are trespassing. They have completely disregarded the local laws. They have kidnapped. They have stolen. And so the governor says, hey, we have asked you many, many times now to go away, to turn around and to go away. And you will not listen, and now you have committed murder and you have killed 7 of our people. So he says, enough is enough. And he orders that the ship be burned to the ground. So the ship was destroyed and all the crew were killed. Now, what do you think, after this incident, what do you think the impression of Westerners is in Korea? At this point, Koreans think, okay, we see what they're doing in China, we see what they're doing in Japan, and now they've come to our country, and they are lawless, they are reckless, they are they're barbarians, right? They're barbarians, especially according to our Confucian ideology. And so there's this very, very negative impression that the Koreans have of Westerners. So again, this is not xenophobia, but the Koreans have very justified reasons for mistrusting the Westerners. This is only compounded by the Ernst Oppert incident. Ernst Oppert was a Shanghai-based Prussian merchant. And he came up with this bizarre scheme to steal the bones of the Taewongun's father from his tomb and to use these bones to blackmail the Joseon Dynasty government into accepting trade and legalizing Christianity. So, in May of 1868, he arrives and he makes it to the tomb of the Taewongun's father, but is too large and too solid to destroy. So Korean troops arrive and he escapes to Incheon, and there in Incheon he tells the local officials there that I have stolen the bones of the Taewongun's father, and then he demands that trade be opened up and that Christianity be legalized in Korea. Well, he's driven off by these guards. He barely escapes with his life. So now we have this very negative impression of Westerners that is only reinforced by this incident. And not only now do Koreans see Westerners as lawless and reckless and violent and hostile, but they also think that they're liars because he lied about stealing the bones. And they also think that Westerners are immoral, because the worst possible thing that you could do as a proper Confucian is to desecrate the tomb of your ancestors. And so the Koreans are thinking, who does this? Like, only barbarians do this. And barbarians are on par with animals. So all of this just reinforces this very negative attitude. Okay, so again, this is not xenophobia, but in fact the Joseon Dynasty has very rational, justified reasons for having a negative impression and mistrusting foreigners. This will conclude part 1 of the lecture, and stay tuned for part 2.